Thorpe. She's an entrepreneur. She's passionate about travel. She's a volunteer junkie. That's to see USA's good fortune, actually, because she has done quite a bit of volunteering for CTAR USA, in particular with the scholarship program, which I think is one of my fondest programs that CTAR USA has. And Tamara was a very great shepherd of the scholarship winners. In her career, she followed the bends and curves in her life to carve out a career that focuses on leadership. And she takes an intercultural approach to generational culture in the workplace, which is exactly what she'll be talking about today. She says she is inspired by and hopes to inspire millennials. And today she's going to be talking with us about age diversity and age inclusion in the new millennium, a topic that is becoming more and more important practically with every day. Some people get younger and some people get older. And I would like to say that I really enjoyed the time that I had with Tamara in Leuven, Belgium, at the CTAR Europa conference, most recently. That was about a week and a half ago, I believe, that I came back from that conference. We do have a picture of Tamara and myself right after she was crowned president of CTAR Europa. I'm so pleased that someone who is an American expat living in Ireland and now president of CTAR Europa and I will be able to work together on some cooperative projects over the 2 years that she and I are both president of our respective associations. And at this point, I will turn it over to Tamara and Karen, if you can get that picture up for people to see at some point during the webinar. At the end would be just as good as at the beginning. Thank you. And I'm going to stop my video so Tamara can take over.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. And for those of you who were here before, thanks for coming back to this rescheduled event. And I'm just going to do a quick check in with Karen about my screen visibility. Is my screen up?
I don't see you, Tamara.
No, it's not. You want to go down to the bottom center of your screen and look for the green share icon.
Perfect. I'm in control. Excellent.
There we go.
Now, perfect.
Groovy.
So, welcome and thank you, Sandy, for the invitation to host this webinar and for the very kind introduction. We had a wonderful time last month in Leuven at the CTAR Europa Congress, and it was wonderful to reconnect with people from CTAR USA and make new relationships here in Europe and to see all the potential between this community across the globe. So it's really, really exciting, and I'm looking forward to sharing more with all of you today about the work that I've been doing. And so probably since about 2016, 17, 18, a lot of my work has been primarily working with my Real Leadership program. It's a leadership development program for emerging leaders, millennial talent, high potential talent. And those programs that I've been offering as bespoke programs within organizations and other events, as well as my own online and live workshop. And as Sandy said, a lot of that work has been really inspired by my real love for young people and working with the younger generation and seeing that really inform my work. And now that I've been in Ireland for the last 2 years, here I'm doing a lot of work around global leaders and working with organizations with their multinational and multi-generational teams. And as Sandy said, I am a former member of CITAR USA, and I am currently a member of Young CITAR and CITAR Ireland, and have been on the CITAR Europa board for the last 2 years, and will serve the next 2 as president. And that is going to be its own leadership exercise, test, and challenge that I'm looking forward to. So developing emerging leaders is what I'm really passionate about. And when I was doing my master's degree in leadership, I really wanted to understand the connection between the work we've done in international education and facilitating international exchanges and study abroad programs. And I wanted to know and understand and really discover if the work young people were doing to learn about other cultures and to travel and study abroad was helping them develop and as leaders. And it was an action research project, and what really emerged from that was this understanding that organizations were struggling with around generational differences and age differences, and how organizations could be more effective in their collaboration across generations. And so I really began to tailor my leadership programs for young professionals to really address some of those challenges that I was seeing within organizations for people to collaborate and work effectively together across age and generational differences. And I don't think that I have to tell any of you that the word millennials, the term millennials, the concept of this millennial generation has been extremely popular, has been, in fact, it's the most researched generation of all time. And to date, it's primarily become synonymous with just a young person, when in fact, millennials aren't really that young anymore, with the oldest millennials now being 40. And so that has really increased the demand among all of you to have to understand what's going on in organizations, because organizations are asking for this kind of information and this kind of thing, and that's why I'm happy to be here with each of you today to talk about the work that I've been doing. So today I will share the role of intercultural competence in navigating generational differences and how our work as intercultural trainers can help organizations be more age inclusive. So I'm going to share sort of my perspective on what's happening in organizations and what's happening in society and culture around these age differences, as well as the approach that I use when I do this work within organizations. And so I want to start by talking a little bit with you about why age is making such a difference in today's organization. So as I talked about, with millennials being so popular, a lot of the focus and challenges that organizations are facing have been quite heavily planted on this one specific generational cohort. And in my work and in my research, I think this concept is really worth being challenged, because I really think what's affecting organizational environments is more than one specific generational cohort, but a change that we see happening on a global perspective within business, within economy, within societies, that is commonly today being referred to as VUCA. So VUCA is a model that's used very often within organizations to analyze change and chaos. And it's being used now to refer to the amount of change and chaos that's happening within organizations and economies and cultures. And so I'll very briefly define each one. So volatile and volatility refers to the speed of change in industry, right? Or the market or the world in general. So when we look at, for example, Uber, right, or Lyft, and these ride-sharing organizations, that they hit the economy very quickly and quite quickly succeeded and really quite rapidly changed the entire environment and industry around transportation. And so it's these kind of change in industry that creates a volatility that creates a sense of anxiety and change that we see in organizations. And that leads to this uncertainty, which is the extent to which we can confidently predict the future. And so today, for a lot of organizations, they're losing that ability to confidently predict the future. So it's creating uncertainty. And that, of course, is because of the complexity. And that complexity refers to the number of factors we need to take into account. So in today's economy and today's organizations, there are a lot more things that have to be taken into account. Before, in the industrial era, organizations, right, made their product and they sold their product. But now what has to be navigated is much more complex in terms of laws, regulations, policies, procedures, the diversity of their workforce, the change in how they market and reach their customer. All of these things are quite significantly different and significantly more complex. The demand for organizations to be more socially responsible, more environmentally responsible. It's just a much more complex landscape for organizations. And as a result, there's more ambiguity, right? That lack of clarity about how to interpret what is happening in the environment. And so I don't believe that the tension, the anxiety, the stress that organizations are feeling is the result of this, very difficult or dynamic or controversial generational cohort, but by this VUCA environment that's happening within business that has created this really unpredictable era of economic and political instability that we have seen on a global scale. We have seen how technology is changing everything that we do, and then the development of these kind of new economies, gig economies like Airbnb, Lyft, Uber, Bitcoin. All of these things are having a significant impact on industry and organization. And so organizations are struggling to figure out how to be more responsive to this new level of complexity. And traditional values that organizations had around hierarchy and authoritarian leadership and how decisions were made are changing. And that is what I believe is sort of the largest contributing factors to the discomfort. And part of the challenge is that we will see, that we are seeing and will continue to see, is that generations that were born with technology or after technology are far more agile and responsive to this VUCA environment than their generational predecessors. So let's talk a little bit about what the generational landscape is in this VUCA environment. Today in organizations, we are seeing anywhere between 4 and 5 generations in a single workplace. There are, in the workforce in the US, so these are a lot of US-based stats, and they're not US-based stats, I'll tell you, that millennials are currently the largest segment of the workforce. They surpassed Generation X in 2016 at 53.5 million. There are 45 million baby boomers that have remained in the workforce, and Generation X is holding on at 52.7. Quite soon, iGen or Gen Z will soon become the fastest growing generation in the workforce as over the next 5 years as they move out of university into the workforce. So I'm going to take a little bit of a breath. We're going to initiate a little poll to kind of get a sense of who's here today. And I have here 5 generational cohorts: traditionalists, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and the iGen or Gen Z. There is a emerging generational cohort between Gen X and millennials that identify as Zennials. Generational researchers haven't confirmed this as a generational cohort, but young Gen Xers and older millennials that don't really feel or identify with their cohort have started to identify in this sort of intermediary group. So Karen, can you initiate the poll so we can get a sense of who's here in terms of their generational identity? And it looks like the poll may require you to answer this second question. If you're finding that the same, go ahead and answer that second question as well, and then we'll discuss the results when we get to that section.
Tamara, I don't see the questions. This is Sandy. And so I'm not sure if other people are able to see it as well.
I did see them. Karen's controlling the questions. So
yeah, it looks like everybody has responded.
Okay, perfect.
You've got one traditionalist who hasn't responded, so add me in.
Okay, great, thanks. So we've got some results here. And we have a predominantly boomer group here with traditionalists, and we could probably note that this number is higher, had Sandy indicated, with Gen Z and millennials. And then I will make a note for when we get to this part that the majority of the group, well, just about the majority, 45% of this group have experienced age discrimination in a professional context. So good to note. So I'm going to close the poll and switch back to my screen. Terrific. And for me, when I talk about generational cohorts, just like any other identity, you may not think that the sort of generational values relate to you, and that very often happens. And so people are completely entitled to identify how they want. You will also note that the years, depending upon which generational research you're you're seeing may vary plus or minus a year or two. So to keep that in mind, that if you've seen different years for a cohort, that's pretty common. There doesn't seem to be any specific years that everybody has agreed to so much as it's just about every 20 years or so since they started doing generational research. And so that question about age discrimination is important because both the young and old are experiencing and feeling discrimination in the workplace. You're either too young or too old, not experienced, too much experience. And I know that many of us who have been involved in organizations and have sat in meetings or interview sessions or review panels have heard comments where people are written off or discounted or excluded as candidates for opportunities because they were too young, had too little experience, they're too young, they're not going to stay, or they're too old and they're too experienced and they're not going to stay. And so this has, this is a challenge, right? And for me, this is ultimately why our work as interculturalists plays a relevant role in this discussion around age difference and generational differences. Because what has millennials being labeled as disloyal, overly ambitious, entitled, etc. There's all these adjectives that have been described to them, when in truth, when you do the research and you have more information, it's important to understand that the economic downturn, and that being the recession, had a significant impact on this generation. That this is a generation that saw their parents give 20, 30, 40 years to an organization to very quickly be laid off with no notice and no reward. And so millennials, as a result of this, don't trust organizations or feel the same sort of loyalty to organizations because organizations have not proven to be trustworthy. So that has had a significant impact, where millennials are also a generation that prefers technology and advancement. These approaches to work and value differences have had an impact. And millennials, when we talk about age discrimination, they experience that generational tension and that lack of understanding and respect. In a lot of the research, millennials are referred to as the Great Recession generation, because unlike previous generations, this generation has had fewer job opportunities, lower savings, and so they are less reluctant, or they are more reluctant to invest in traditional wealth building strategies like real estate, the stock market, banks, etc. And so when we think about our work as interculturalists and we think, why are specific cultures a certain way, we have to look at significant events and aspects that have really informed that culture and how they operate. And it's the same. Just as when we looked at age discrimination for people in the workforce who are older, last year, AARP, which if you're in the United States and American, you're quite familiar with the AARP, which is an organization that provides support and resources for older Americans. They did a significant survey on age discrimination in the workplace as it relates to people over 45. And what they found was that in adults over 45, that 61% of the respondents said they had either seen or experienced age discrimination in the workplace. And more than 50% of older workers indicate that they believe that age discrimination started for them in their 50s. But we also know that 72% of women between the ages of 45 and 74 say that they've experienced age discrimination in the workplace, but only 57% of men of the same age range say they have experienced age discrimination in the workplace. So I'll repeat that one more time. So 61% of respondents over 45 said they have seen or experienced age discrimination. More than 50% of older workers have seen or experienced age discrimination starting at age 50. 72% of women between the ages of 45 and 74 said they had faced age discrimination at work, while only 57% of men in that same age group say they have experienced it. And the research also showed that older women, particularly African Americans and Hispanics, and those who are unemployed, were more likely to feel that they were the subject of discrimination. And so when we did the poll, we saw that there was 45% have expressed feeling age discrimination, and 36%, which I thought was an interesting number, said you're unsure. And so I think that that's an interesting fact that maybe when we get to the Q&A we can explore. Because I know when I talk with millennials and young professionals specifically, a lot of what they identify as age discrimination is very explicit bias in terms of people speaking rather openly about people, about millennials in particular, not having
Hey, Tamara, your audio has cut out.
All right, am I back?
Yes.
Perfect, okay.
You are. Thank you.
So when I speak with millennials, right, they quite openly have been told by supervisors, by managers in team meetings that their generation is lazy, entitled, overly ambitious, underqualified, and they have seen as a collective group being excluded, criticized within the workplace that has heavily affected them. And I think that we all have seen within our networks and our communities that for people as they get older, finding new employment can be particularly challenging and take a significant amount of time, much longer than their younger peers. So what does that mean for what needs to happen? So I don't think that organizations specifically need more information about millennials. As I said, they are in fact the most researched generation of all time. You could Google how to blank millennials, manage millennials, lead millennials, engage millennials, recruit millennials, and you'll get tons of resources. But a lot of those resources, from my perspective as somebody who does most of my work in leadership development, that a lot of those are really what I would consider good leadership practices on creating inclusive work environments, right? How do we include the voices of different groups within our organization? And how do we leverage the different talents resources and abilities of the diverse talent in our workplace, specifically in this case, as it relates to age. And so we know that as intercultural practitioners, that there is a balance between culture general information and culture-specific information. And if we only give people culture-specific information, right? If you're going to France and here are the 10 things you need to know about doing business in France or living in France, that you're far more likely to only reinforce stereotypes if you don't provide that culture general information that gives people a broader understanding of what culture is, how they are also in and of themselves part of culture, their own culture that they are bringing to a new context, and understanding larger paradigms so that they're developing their own intercultural competence. And with age and age inclusion, it's the same thing. There is danger in going to organizations and only providing them qualities about millennials if you fail to address the qualities that each different generational cohort is bringing, and not only qualities but values. So what are the different values that are coming into the workplace, and how are those values coming into conflict? And then how does this organization develop the attitude, skills, and knowledge they need to be able to navigate and negotiate those value differences? So that is the primary approach I take with organizations. So when organizations call me and ask me to specifically come and talk about millennials, I do not do that work because I think there is a danger to it. And certainly when I was doing my work and started calling myself the millennials mentor, people kept saying, oh, well, you must go and tell people about millennials and how to fix millennials. And I said, no, there's nothing wrong with millennials. They're not broken. They don't need to be fixed. They don't need to be changed. That's not what's happening. What's happening are these other things that I've talked about that have that one is the VUCA environment that is not an effect of millennials. Two, it actually is an effect of their predecessors who have in fact changed what's happening in economy and organization. And two, age bias, which is as old as time and one of the last socially acceptable forms of bias and discrimination. And so it's important, and one of the reasons why I think interculturalists are uniquely qualified, because there are lots of people who identify themselves as millennial experts, but they don't in fact have the skills necessary to help teams and organizations navigate the information that they've been given about a specific generational cohort, nor do they go deep into those values conflicts and look at what are the other values other generations are bringing in that are coming into conflict. So for me, the task for us is to help organizations foster age-inclusive work environments with high-performing multi-generational teams, because that is the current reality, right? Older generations are no longer retiring at a younger age, and so we were going to see this ongoing age diversity. So in an age-inclusive work environment, they encourage the recruitment and retention of an age-diverse workforce and foster a cooperative intergenerational learning environment. So that is the objective of age-inclusive work environments. And very often we see examples with some organizations that do seek to bring the older generation into the workforce, as well as the younger generation, and understanding the relevance of that balance. And so we are seeing more of it. But once everybody's there, how do we make sure everybody's working together and successfully navigating and negotiating the value differences that they bring? And when they are doing it right, an organization is able to be more responsive and agile to this VUCA. I recently was speaking to a group in Fargo, North Dakota, which was a wonderful place to visit. And a lot of the people in the room were bankers. And one of the more senior bankers asked me if I thought that this change, this gig economy, that this breakdown of traditional wealth savings organizations like a bank, if it was all going to come back around and everybody would get over Bitcoin and eventually trust banks again. And I told him, no, I do not think so. I do not think so, because keep in mind that most people under the age of 35 do most of their banking through their phone, right? They shop through their phone, they give money in exchange to their friends through their phone, and the ease of that and the security they feel of that is not going to go away. And so I said to this banker, the best thing you could do is start having conversations with people in your organization under 35 and find out how your bank can be more agile and adept. Because they're never going to convince people to bring in bags of cash to their bank anymore. I think there's very little banks can do to convince people to start doing that. If they can start having these two-way conversations, I think that there's a lot of value, so that they as an organization can be more responsive in this environment. And then, of course, increase retention, engagement, and performance of new talent. Millennials have been labeled a job hoppers. I think that that's what the term is. But in fact, and overly ambitious. But the research has shown that millennials are far more likely to stay with an organization where they are being mentored and trained and where they have access to senior leaders than organizations that would give them a raise. So they're not looking for more money, they're looking for more skills, more training, more opportunity, more mentoring, and more access, which is far more affordable than giving people raises and losing talent and having to onboard new talent. As I said, when I was in Fargo, my host was showing me around some of the new buildings in town and pointed to a bank and said, oh, and they've just built this new wonderful top floor for the executives filled with all this beautiful art. And I thought, what a significant fail that they've put the most senior talent all together on one floor, where all the people working at the bottom who are younger, less experienced, have less access to them. And what an opportunity would be for the organization if that more seasoned executive leaders were peppered throughout the building so that younger talent had access to them. It would significantly change how the organization functions and how the younger talent feels engaged. But that traditional hierarchy comes normal to those more traditional industrial era industries. So when organizations can get this right, it allows them to sustain a much more competitive edge and support development and career growth, strengthen their organizational intelligence by keeping talent in the organization, and build sustainable communities of knowledge through mentoring, training, intergenerational collaboration, mutual mentoring, and this knowledge of transfer really helps organizations as they grow and expand and have people succeeding in the organization. So what does that mean for us as interculturalists? I think most of us already have the tools. So lots of people, as you all have gotten more calls from organizations to talk about this, people have reached out to me. And a lot of what we need, we already have. We have our own definitions of culture. This is the one that I use, and I replaced the word culture for generation, right? So however you define culture is how you could define a generation, right? And here we have a group of people with a shared set experiences that shape their values, beliefs, and behaviors. And so it's quite the same. And when we look at however you define intercultural competence, I use this one from Darla Deerdorf's work and her book, and I've taken that and I've replaced intercultural with generational. So what we want is for age-inclusive organizations to have the ability to communicate and behave effectively and appropriately in intergenerational situations based on one's generational knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And then they're going to be able to generate much more increasingly complex perceptions and experiences of generational differences. And this is what is really vital, because each generational cohort, on top of all their other identities that are informing their differences, are coming in with these generational values that are really impacting work. And there's so much focus on one cohort that we are missing those other values and how they are shaping and informing the conversations. And so we want to make sure that we're looking at all these aspects of generational differences and the value of age inclusion and generational competence, so that organizations are more accurately interpreting behavior, right? So rather than seeing the millennials as overly ambitious and wanting to move up the ladder quickly, they have to understand that their salary may not be appropriate for their cost of living, and to look at how that is affecting what millennials are asking for in the workplace. And that more opportunity and more recognition may not necessarily always be related to wanting more money, but wanting to learn more and do more. And so it's about reframing some of these labels and stereotypes that organizations have and putting them into context, so that organizations understand that this behavior is value driven, and that they then can make choices about their own behavior. One of the things I talk about in workshops all the time is Gen Xers, which is my generation, and our overuse and often abuse of email. Email was a technology that we were given that was really our first way of using technology to communicate at work, to expedite our communication. But also Gen Xers are more comfortable in the workplace working in silos. And as a result, we do a significant amount of our communication through email, which for us, we understand how to use it, we organize it, we create folders and subfolders, and that sort of management of email comes quite naturally to us because we grew with those features as email developed. But younger generations don't want to receive emails that are one sentence, two sentences, or three sentences. They can't understand why that's not just sent in a text. And so people complain that millennials aren't responsive to emails, and millennials are trying to figure out why they have 1,000 emails that are all things that people could have walked 5 feet to say to them or sent to them in a text. And so we have to negotiate this. And I basically tell Gen Xers, stop using email so much. It's okay to get out of your chair and walk across the office and to speak to somebody or to send a text. And we all know in the business world, there are things you have to put in an email, but we all also know that we probably sent emails that we could probably swivel in our chair and say to someone rather than sending it in an email. But this is what's going to help organizations develop much more effective relationships. You all know Jack, hopefully, or met him, seen him, read his work. But this is one of my favorite quotes, that people are different around the world, but their needs, however, are the same. How they satisfy their needs is different, and that's what we mean by culture. And this applies to the same concept around generational differences, that each generational difference, they have their needs, but how they are going to satisfy those needs are quite different. And that's an important part of the learning for us as trainers and for organizations. Very quickly, I want to refer to the work by Juana Amaria, who did work on research on global millennials. She's with Language and Culture Worldwide. She published a wonderful report that's available online, where she looked at what are the influencers that shape different generational cohorts. And she used this theoretical model about the life cycle period and cohort effect. And the idea is that in terms of a life cycle effect, that at different times in our life and different ages and stages, we experience common things. So there are some shared experiences of being a teenager, There's shared experiences of being in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, and so on. And a lot of the initial backlash against millennials in many cases was really common characteristics of people being 20. If you think you weren't arrogant in your 20s, then you may need to go check back in with a parent or friend, because most of us were pretty arrogant in our 20s. These are things that just come with a certain time and stage and age in our life. But our generational cohorts are also informed by the period. And so what you see here on your screen are different periods of time and different social, political, cultural events that happened that informed a generation. So that we know that the Great Depression, the World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, the HIV/AIDS epidemic, these had significant impact on older generations. Understanding that millennials have been very affected by 9/11, the golden age of technology, VUCA, and the Great Recession. And when we think about what's to come with Gen Z, a generation that's going to be true digital natives, growing up with smartphones and social media. And also, right, if you think about anybody under the age of 12, 13, 14, this is a group of people who have only known Obama and Trump to be presidents of the United States. And how that is shaping their worldview is going to be very interesting to see. We also have to note that there is significant global diversity. And so what this generation looks like around the world is different. In China, they're referred to as the post-80s. In South Africa, the lost generation, and in Europe, born free, but also now more commonly referred to as millennials. But keep in mind that what these different cohorts have experienced at different points of time are shaping them, and that there is significant geographic, global, and socioeconomic variations. Also keeping in mind that most of the research on millennials in the US are very targeted groups. So these are typically groups that are educated young professionals in corporate environments or in higher education. So when we look at generational cohorts that do not fall under those categories, then we are looking at a generation whose qualities, characteristics, and values have not been documented or explored on any scale. So we have to be mindful that when we're referencing research, that we're speaking to a very privileged group of respondents and data pool. So in my work, I work with organizations to look at where are starting points of places in common. So we know that boomers and millennials share that both came of age during a time of war and chaos, and both identify as agents of change. Traditionalists and millennials came of age after a recession, and both have that experience of uncertainty and job insecurity. Gen Xers and millennials strive for a work-life balance and are ambitious and eager to learn. So these are sort of common experiences that have shaped values that are potential common areas or starting points of discussion if we look at bridging differences from the starting point of where we have things in common. And this is something that I look at with organizations. The other then is to look at what are the values that are in conflict. So with boomers and millennials, right, that because millennials are more self-reliant as collaborators, these come into conflict with boomers. And status, right? So this particularly different value between boomers and millennials, because for boomers, status is given and maintained regardless of performance and competence. But for millennials, status is earned and only maintained based on performance and competence. And so this creates quite a bit of conflict in the workplace because millennials are much more comfortable questioning and challenging authority if that person in authority has proven in any way to be incompetent. Traditionalists and millennials come into conflict around technology, work ethic, and status as well. And keep this in mind that every generational cohort, just like every culture, has a work ethic. But what it looks like is different. And this goes back to that quote Jack has, that everybody has the same need, but how they satisfy it is different. And every generation has the need to feel satisfied by their work and to earn money and to have their work have meaning to them in some way or another. But that is different for each generational cohort. And Gen Xers and Millennials. Gen Xers are much more individualistic. They are less collaborators, and this is what comes into conflict with Millennials, is because Millennials are much more collaborative. And status. And so you'll see here that status, how we get it, how we maintain it, is a conflict point between millennials and every other generation. And so this is something I think to be explored within organizations. So again, what I have noted as the more common areas of conflict or values that come into conflict are work ethic, authority and earned status, hierarchy, communication modalities. So when do we speak? When do we text? When do we email? When does it go in a letter? When do we have conversations? What's said in front of who and how we do that? All of these things are areas of conflict that organizations need to start having conversations. How organizations reward and promote, because what each person of a different cohort and age and stage may want from their organization is different. Work-life balance and work environments. So these are all areas or values that come into conflict for organizations that are great for places to shape discussions around. So strategies that we can use are unconscious bias, which many of you may use in other forms of work, but as it relates to age. Working with organizations to foster generational competence, and that's looking at bias and perceptions and helping people understand those value differences and starting to have discussions. Move discussions from behavioral qualities and characteristics to values, and encourage intergenerational collaboration through mutual mentoring and cross-training. And getting people working together across difference are going to be vital strategies for organizations that we can all be a part of in fostering for organizations. So I will leave this up for a moment. I will now open it up to all of you to ask questions and share any thoughts, and leave it to Karen to tell me what you all are asking.
Tamara, I'd like to thank you for an amazing, for me, revelation about age bias and the issues between the various generations in the workplace. Very informative, and to me, the really most important thing that I got from this was the intercultural approach to working with the different generations. So I'd like to thank you for that. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat room. People can unmute and ask questions, or they can put their question into the chat.
I did just unmute everybody so they can speak up if they do have a question. Feel free.
I'm gonna stop my share. That makes a difference. And I'm gonna turn on my video. Maybe if people see my face, they'll want to ask me something. Hi, everybody. So I know that was a lot of information, but as Sandy said, it's probably about 5 or 6 years ago, right after I did my master's research and looking at best practices in intergenerational collaboration, that I really started to explore what was that intersectionality between the work I did as an interculturalist and the work that I did with young people, and how could I help older folks be more willing and open to working with younger people from a place of equity. And that was the challenge, right? So how do we get people working without a sense of superiority or and giving people a sense of inferiority because I'm older and I've done more, I know more, and I can do better. And so for me, it was a real click where I thought that's what we do in intercultural work, is we help people understand that each of us comes to the table with a certain set of cultural values. And when we're able to identify our own values and understand yours, we can start to navigate that better. And so that was the revelation for me that really has been kind of the crux of the work that I have done over the last 6-7 years. And I guess I'll ask, have any of you been asked or have done any trainings or workshops so far on millennials or multi-generational teams or intergenerational collaboration in any form?
Tamara, this is Leanne.
Hi, Leanne.
Hi, I'm in California. Yeah, I have participated in one training earlier, intergenerational communication, which I think is really valuable. I don't think we necessarily think about that. I'm wondering, you know, in the time you've had, for example, in Ireland or elsewhere, can you give us any specific examples that you've seen that maybe was very specifically related to Irish culture, for example, that you might not have seen in the US?
I won't say specifically Irish culture, and I say that one because I live in Dublin, and a lot of the organizations here are extremely multicultural, and as you may know, in Dublin we have a very large tech industry that is has a lot of young professionals, millennials, right? We've got the Google, the Facebook, we've got all of those here. And so specifically here in Ireland, that shows up a little differently. What I can say is I was speaking with a trainer who identifies as a diversity and inclusion trainer who's based in Spain. And when I asked her what the top 2 areas of diversity she was addressing with organizations, she said the first was gender and the second was millennials. And so what what that tells me is there is a global demand for understanding age differences, and I think there is a demand for age inclusion on a global scale, but also what's shaping and what has shaped Irish millennials, I think, is different and not something that I have spent a lot of time researching.
Thank you.
But thank you for asking.
Mm-hmm. I have another question too. You were mentioning about how millennials are looking maybe more for mentoring rather than, you know, salary increase. One of the things that I've experienced is a desire for a bigger title. And I know, you know, I'm in a university. Bigger titles aren't easy to come by. And part of the struggle we've had is, it's possible to give new opportunities and things like that, but it's not always possible to change the classification or change the title. And, how to help provide that kind of satisfaction, without being able to change the title and what have you.
What's the need they're trying to satisfy with the title change?
My impression is that they feel like I've done this, for a year or two, and now I'm ready for new and bigger things. So it's not enough to just give more opportunity or a different responsibility. And then that can be challenging anyway in a university. You can't just throw additional things in. But that they're really looking for, I've done this for a year and now I'm ready to be like an assistant manager or, a manager or director or something like that. And what can you do for me?
So I think for me, the question I would have is what's the need they're trying to satisfy? So if they're not looking for more responsibility or new opportunity, but they want a title change, then my guess is they're looking for recognition. But I think rather than guessing or assuming, that might be a question to ask, right? What need will that satisfy? What can be achieved by a new title? If it's recognition, what are other ways your contributions can be recognized? And that's, the point about how can we have these conversations to get more information without judging, right? Because I think that there is a common feedback I get from organizations is that people do within 1, 2, 3 years ask for something that folks who have been around a lot longer don't think they're entitled to ask for. And I think that that's something that people who've been around longer, who had to work longer for the title, work longer for the tenure, or whatever it is in whichever industry, need to let go of, because they're not going to stop asking. And so this is one of those areas of how do we negotiate what they need with the confines or the processes and procedures of our industry. And in more traditional hierarchical industries like universities, banks, etc., these are more challenging because the structures are no longer relevant to the environment. And that's something that everybody's got to figure out how to navigate.
Very good. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Hi, Amanda. I see you're there. Thanks for coming.
Hello.
Hey, Tamara, we got a great comment from Chad. He said how much he appreciated reminders about the language we use when talking about this topic, especially the discussion always seems to put the millennials as the subject or of the sentence or the issue, and how we can use our language to shape the dialogue and consider all of our roles. And he says, thank you for that.
Thank you, Chad. And I think that's really, really what is the difference that interculturalists can make in facilitating these conversations. As I said, there are lots of people out there that have identified as generational experts or millennial experts who are getting paid a lot of money. They've told me how much they're getting paid. They're getting paid a lot of money to give people a lot of information about a single generational cohort, but they're leaving that organization ill-equipped to manage the information that they get and to use it productively and effectively to ultimately meet the goals and values of that organization. And that's why this intersection of our work is, I think, so important and should be led by interculturalists. That's what I think. I think we should be leading these conversations.
Hi, Tamara. This is Maria. How are you?
Good. Hi, Maria.
So nice to see you. Hey, so I was thinking in terms of what you mentioned about equity and who is the dominant culture in organizations, not in terms of numbers, but who has the power and who has the blind spots about their own culture and what it is underneath of the iceberg for that generation, and how to really build inclusion is about first uncovering that, as you mentioned, but then being willing to be flexible and change things in your organization so these new generations can thrive. Because what we're trying to do is like, no, you have to become like us, or you have to jump the same hoops that we jumped when we went through this, then we're not being inclusive, but we are. It's not inclusion, it's assimilation. It's like, hey, you guys have to assimilate, and that doesn't work. And they go to another job where they can be who they are, right?
Yeah, that's 100% what's happening, right? It's like that proverb, the Japanese proverb that the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Mm-hmm. And that's what's happening to an entire generation. They're being told that, and it's only going to, and right, and when I say generation, it's going to happen to Gen Zs, and is already happening to Gen Zs as they enter the workplace, that the way you want to do things doesn't work here. Mm-hmm. Rather than exploring how do we make your worldview help us grow and evolve as an organization. And that's what I talked about, that there are industries that are getting real stuck, right? So that people, you can hold on to wanting to maintain traditional taxis, but at the end of the day, I, as a woman, would rather get in an Uber where my driver is tracked, my route is tracked, my location is tracked. I feel much safer than just getting into a taxi with a perfect stranger where there's no way to track what car I got into, where I got in it, and where I am. So, and that's a basic human need of safety that the gig economy has responded to. So this idea that that's somehow going to go away to maintain some old system or some old way of doing business, it's just not going to work anymore. As I said, the oldest millennials are now 40, 41. They are in positions of leadership and management, and they will make these changes and shifts over time. And so it goes back to the question that I know all of you have heard in a training. Well, who's supposed to change and adapt, right? We've learned this cultural information. Who's supposed to change, them or us? Mm-hmm. And the answer is, yeah, everybody. Everybody here has to flex with the information they've been given. So are millennials carrying age bias? Absolutely, right? They're human. They live on this planet. All of us carry age bias. And age bias typically impacts the young and the older. And I have already had, young professionals, their 20s and 30s and 40s, come to me and say, oh my God, how are we going to hire these Gen Zs? My little brother is an idiot and can barely put two and two together, right? So I think that that's something to be mindful of. And that's why addressing age bias rather than a specific cohort is more important, because age bias is something we pass on from one generation to the next generation. So if we don't start equipping people with this understanding of challenging our bias and asking more questions, this will only persist. As I said, AARP has a campaign called that's #DisruptAging. And they have some phenomenal videos on YouTube that really articulate this need for everybody to understand age discrimination and age bias. That can be really powerful tools I use in my workshops. And again, it's #DisruptAging. And there's several videos on YouTube. I use one specifically, I forget what it's called, but it has some younger folks in their 20s, and they're asked to say what age they think is old, and then they're asked to engage in behaviors that how would an older person send a text, and how would an older person cross the street, and then eventually they're matched with an older person, and they each have to teach each other something. And you get to see this really powerful exercise where these young people's perception about what is old is completely challenged and reframed in a matter of minutes. And so it's a really, really powerful tool, because this is something that every person of every age has to address, the age bias that we hold, even with ourselves. I spent 30 days, I did a 30-day internal age bias cleanse of my own mind, that I decided to spend 30 days without using any ageist language or attitudes about myself to myself. And it was incredibly difficult, because I realized how often I discount my own self. I'm old, I can't do that. Oh, bending over hurts because my age. You know, all these things we say internally to ourselves because of our age. And just spending that 30 days of cleansing my own mind was incredibly, incredibly powerful. So for me, that's really the task at hand.
Can I be heard?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I think Cassie has a question. Oh, there's our picture.
Yes, I've been struggling with pushing buttons and getting double visions and all the rest of it. In any case, very good to hear you. Interesting, very interesting. I have a sort of a question, and I know I'm definitely traditionalist. I'm 75. Although, because I've been traveling the world on my own, and since then I'm also very much younger. However, okay, if I'm dealing with very young, I know, younger people or whatever, they have a way, and I have a way, they have a way of saying, well, this is how it is, because they studied the research. You know, so I'll come up with a little pearl of wisdom or whatever, because to me, my role was to teach them how to interact, how to be closer and stuff like that. They don't see that as my role at all. Well, or they do, but they don't want to admit it or ask for it. And they wanted to show me everything, you know, and I'm like, I'm exhausted. I can't follow everybody's probably, anyway. But I just want to say there's a kind of a snobbishness that I feel in sometimes in response, you know, when you're listening to the young person, they say, well, that's just not how it is. You know, the chemicals work this way, and this is how the diet works. And, you know, you've got it wrong. And I just don't know how to even answer that. It's like, and that would take 10 years and a whole research study. So do you have any comments on different perceptions of what is wisdom and how to share it gracefully across generations? How's that?
I think that's a really good question to ask them. Right? I think, you know,
one of they think they're right. They
the
think
first
right
tenets of well, I think almost everybody feels that way most of the time. Today on my morning walk, I was thinking about how most of the time I think I'm the one who knows everything. But I would say, right, that one of the first tenets of intercultural work is to be curious. And I think that when you are thinking that your role or wisdom is being challenged, to ask that question, you know, what do you see my role? How would you like me to help you? What resource, what knowledge, what skills do I have that you want access to? Because as you said, my role is to teach them. And I think you have clarity on what your role is that comes from your past experience. And now they're asking for something different. And I think it's worthwhile to ask what that is. And to not, you know, and then again, right, the second tenet of intercultural practice is to suspend judgment, right? So be curious, suspend judgment, ask questions. And that's a great starting point.
I guess I hear all that. I see all those ideals, and as a traditionalist, you know, who's basically, I don't know, a teaching generation. I raised my brother with disability, you know, all kinds of different things that you've had to teach, and suddenly you're supposed to be curious. And you know, it's not that I don't get it. It's just that when it comes to knowledge, I think sometimes maybe as a traditionalist, you've learned a lot of knowledge without doing all the research, so you don't know how to even define it. I don't know how, you know, you lose your own words. You don't know how to speak without, you know, when they can quote research so fast and throw it right at you. You know, as if that was
Yeah,
wisdom.
and I think that's a great conversation to have with them, right? And because, you know, I do a lot of work around mentoring. And mentoring used to be, you know, conceived as this idea that this older, wiser person had all this knowledge and wisdom, and they poured it into this young person who was this waiting, empty vessel to receive information. And over the years, that has really evolved. And what I mentioned earlier, because young people are coming to the table having had a really different life experience in their first 20 years than your first 20 years. And so they're coming to the table with a sense of equity that they may not know as much as you, but what they know is as valuable as what you know. And that's a values conflict, right? And so that's where they're coming.
Simply incorrect. And simply incorrect.
Pardon me?
I'm saying that with tongue in cheek as definitely a judgment, but there is something that you learn from wisdom because you kind of been through all those objections and 15 more.
Absolutely. They're just looking for reciprocity. They're looking for equity and reciprocity.
Okay.
And I think and there's an opportunity for you to find out more from them what they need and want and how you can serve and facilitate that.
Thanks.
You're welcome, Cassie. All right, looks like we have maybe time for one more question. Did anybody else have a question?
Tamara, my name's Marianne Goodwin, and thank you for your talk and it was very helpful. I don't know if I can be heard, I can't tell.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. You mentioned when you were giving the periods of time and the historical events that impacted the different generational cohorts, you mentioned a woman who's done extensive study in this area and that we're drawing from some of it. I didn't write down her name or get that. Could you share that again?
I'm gonna type it into the chat.
Great.
There, I put that into the chat.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Certainly. All right, one more question. That was an easy one. So I will let you each know that you please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Also on my website, which is my name, tamarathorpe.com, I have several white papers that sort of outline the research around this conversation today. So for those of you who are more research-based and are looking for sort of citations and places to get information, I have 3 or 4 different white papers on my website that look at, one, the intersectionality between generational differences and intercultural understanding, that look at the role of mentoring in facilitating age-inclusive work environments, and another on the leadership areas of focus of leadership for multi-generational teams. So each of you, you can access those at tamarathorpe.com under free stuff. So please go and download those, and if you subsequently have questions, feel free to ping me via email or on LinkedIn. And thanks for coming today. I really appreciate it.
Laura, thank you so much. This was really wonderful. I would like to make sure people know that you are talking to us from Dublin. And so there was a little bit of a time lag on the video of you, but we all understood exactly what you were saying, and it was lovely to see you. So I would like to thank everybody for joining this time, this month. We do have monthly webinars, except that we're going to take a summer vacation in July. So that will be our summer vacation, and we hope to see you in August. Thanks again, Tamara.
Thank you, Sandy, and everybody for coming. It was a great afternoon.